All right, and so we're back, and welcome to the stage, Paul Boshears and Abriel Shipley. I'm so excited to have both of you here. So Paul is an Atlanta-based UX researcher and designer. He earned his PhD at the European Graduate School in Sassfi, Switzerland. A thought leader on the intersection of culture and emerging technologies, his writings on art and neuroscience have appeared in publications like Neuron, Art Papers, and Newsweek. A co-founder of the media agnostic publication platform Continent, Paul has developed an internationally recognized body of work. With world-class research skills, both quantitative and qualitative, Paul also excels as a creative collaborator and would love to learn more about any of your projects as well. Abriel is a risk-taking designer who's always learning new subjects and business practices in creating new, well-designed solutions. Currently works as a UX designer at the Home Depot on the enterprise UX team. In her spare time, you can catch her performing aerial hoop, cooking, and playing board games with her husband and 2 cats. Paul and Abriel are the UX Hustle dream team. When I spoke at UX Hustle Summit last year, Paul was front and center and was the most attentive, enthusiastic, and just the person you want like right in front of you as you're speaking. And Abriel volunteered at UX Hustle last year, and let me tell you, planning and organizing and getting everything together is no joke. And she made everyone feel so welcome and just like they were exactly where they needed to be. They're both shining stars in the UX community, and I'm always happy when I'm able to run into them and pick their brains. So welcome to the stage. Paul and Abriel, take it away.
Yay! Good morning. Gosh, I hope everyone has the opportunity to be introduced by Amanda Worthington. That's really...
It was such a great intro, and I feel so honored already.
Yeah. Yeah, so hi, good morning. I'm Paul Boshears. This is Abriel Shipley. We're really excited to be sharing with you some ideas and some vocabulary that we believe can help us not only navigate the complexity of our organizations, your organizations, but also that these can act as ways of generating good counsel that really is expected of UXers. And again, I want to take this moment to thank the organizers for all of their efforts in making this year's summit happen. Having organized some conferences like this myself over my career, I can really appreciate how much effort they've been expending over the last several months. And I'd like to also thank Sophia because her talk last year, Mastering Ikigai, Ubuntu, and Kaizen, motivated me to want to share some of these ideas here today. And I'm going to theoretically advance my slides here. And it looks like I did. Wow. Hooray. And so what I'm hoping, the too long didn't read version of this is I'm hoping you'll come away from our talk today with a few nuggets here. Primarily, first and foremost, that your career is more than the accumulation of projects you've completed. Your career is a critical part of a flourishing life. And Confucian philosophy has some helpful resources for developing flourishing lives. And also, I'd like a chance to just think with you about how paradoxical golden rules can be. So you'll have to apologize. I'm also having my house painted this morning, and I have a very small dog that's not afraid to bark at anything, including leaves blowing around. So it may get a little bit loud on my side, and I apologize in advance for that. So not until not so long ago, I was a professor of philosophy and art history, and Chinese philosophies were among my areas of expertise. And when I came to UX design and research, some folks thought that this was a really radical career change. But I knew that my transition into my new roles and teams was in many ways a continuation of a career that had been marked by a series of ongoing concerns and the cultivation of talents. But as a job seeker, my challenge during my job search was to craft a series of narratives that illustrated the consistency in my career, like that through line, a single thread that could weave together all of these different things I've done. I like to joke that I've had an extensive collection of hairnets and name tags throughout my lifetime. So to craft that narrative, I've found it useful to reflect on some passages from the anecdotes. In Chinese, it's called the lunya. Nobody is expected to learn any Chinese today. All the words are going to be in English for the most part. And there'll be a few that are in Chinese, but please don't feel like you have to commit to any of those. But I like to reflect on the anecdotes from time to time. I do it at different moments in my life because I find them to be both inspirational and also aspirational. A general reminder that living a good life entails, ideally, a number of decades of self-cultivation. Let's see here. And well, what was it that this Confucius guy was teaching, right? Like, what's that all about? He didn't leave like a series of commandments, but rather a series of recommendations for how to become a fuller human being by investing wholeheartedly into our social relations. And to accomplish this, he advocated that we sincerely involve ourselves and become masterful in the performance of all the rituals of human communal living. Now, these rituals can be really big ones like weddings or funerals, but they can more often than not, they'll actually be kind of small things that we might not even pay attention to. Underappreciated things like social conventions, like how to give a handshake or how to enter an elevator and stand in the correct place. Now, there's some real magic there, right? Like, they are social conventions, but we as a society don't ever convene to decide how they happen. And yet they persist, right? Like, we don't all show up at the Georgia World Congress Center here in downtown Atlanta and decide, okay, this is how a handshake's gonna happen. And when we all enter the elevator, look this way, not that way, right? This is some of what Confucius is asking us to think about. And like I mentioned before, I have this background in philosophy. So like one of the first questions that you're going to be asked when you enter into your first philosophical conversation with somebody is, who am I, right? Not just like, hey, who are you? Like, what do you do for fun? But who are you? And if you ask a Confucian, who are you? Like, who am I? You're likely going to get a pretty straightforward answer, right? I am the child of my parents. I'm the spouse of my partner. I'm the parent to our child. I'm the sibling to my parents' children, and so on. Now, that might seem like just like a laundry list of relationships, but I hope it's also illuminating the really critical role that our families play in our identity formation. And I want to really kind of focus in on this for just a moment, that like we're not being asked to reflect on some ideal, never going to actually meet this target because it doesn't even exist on this plane of existence, like it is perfect and we will never be perfect. That's never really the focus. The focus is always on what's right here at hand. What do we have to work with, right? So it's not an appeal to like being like this perfect person that has never existed, but instead to just really marinate on and reflect on and appreciate, how did we even get here, right? Everyone with a belly button, right, was, has something in common, right? And what is it that we have in common with each other? For the Confucian, we become individuated through our sincere dedication to acting out our obligations and our duties to others. And through our sincere and wholehearted performance of our roles and obligations to our families, to our neighbors, and our countries, we come closer to becoming the exemplars of a particularly admirable kind of person, a junzi, the term on the left there. And when we fail to wholeheartedly participate in these meaning-generating relationships and rituals, we're not only failing to become this exemplary person, but we're also on the path to becoming a kind of person that's not really worth mentioning at all, right? When we fail in these ways, we become really petty. The term here is shaoren. A shaoren literally means a small person, right? Like, so I hope that what you have in opposition here is the idea that like, if we don't invest wholeheartedly into our relations, into our teams, into our friendships, into our neighborhood communities, and so on, that we lose the opportunity to become expanded by those relationships, and we really stay small. We may even get smaller and smaller and smaller, right? So Confucius created a legacy that at its heart provides guidance for people to live aesthetically. And that has kind of two meanings there. Like, aesthetics is about good judgment and also good taste or artistic merit. And he's advocating for both simultaneously. So thinking about a career, like there's kind of like a pretty obvious passage to think about when we think about our careers is, This one here from 2:4 in the Analects. At 15, my heart and my mind. And this is just a quick little sidebar here, that in the classical Chinese philosophical tradition, like, we don't have a distinction between our hearts, like our emotions and so on, our passions. There's not a distinction between our heads and our hearts. It's a continuum. So what's being pointed out here is not only like that you should like master at 15 years old this that your heart and your mind should be connected towards learning, but rather that like we become probably pretty good at doing this, probably close to being masterful at learning in this instance, say, and we will continue to practice these things throughout our lives. So it's not like a one and done, like, oh, finally I'm 15, I can no longer learn, right? Like, but instead that we continuously are doing this process, right? Well, what does this really mean, right? There's a lot of Chinese words in here, Paul, and I'm not sure I'm into it. So I hope what can kind of clarify a little bit are the words that my teachers, Roger Ames and Henry Rosemont Jr., gave us to try and understand a little bit better what's actually going on here. Because it's not simply just what's on the paper, but also we have to think about like the lifetime of practicing this. So one way to interpret it that I found useful is to follow their reading, that like we strike out in a direction, right? Like we have to head off in some direction, and we get better and better at choosing which direction to head in. And then we learn how, while on that adventure, we learn how to take our places at different moments, right? And we become better and better. We have some more facility with knowing which way to go, right? Like, how do we choose which way to go? Like, we want to go in a direction, but which way do we even know how to go? That actually takes some time to sort out, right? That's what a career change is in many ways about. We come to sort of appreciate and realize the terrain around us, and we can, later on in life, we may be even better at being able to kind of tune in to what that terrain affords us. And once we're able to be masterful at that, we can journey wherever we want to go without being led astray, right? Without misadventure. So what makes a career, right? Among my hopes from this talk is that folks will get at least an intuitive sense that all of your experiences are valid and useful experiences when we think about how we want to grow professionally and personally. We may think that careers are the result of learning a technical skill like learning how to do rapid prototyping, right? And then you learn how to do that, like you get good at Sketch or Figma, and now you just crank out a bunch of work, and that's a career. It's not quite that, right? Measuring our careers as a collection of outputs from projects is really too limiting for anyone's long-term satisfaction. It's just dehumanizing. It's mechanical. It really is that way of thinking of our careers as just cranking out outputs is the path to automation, right? And so reconceptualizing our careers is something that my Confucian training enables, because fundamentally a career is a matter of Kung Fu mastery. And I think this is something that Nandita Gupta touched on yesterday. Here I wanted to share with you a picture of my Shifu, my master, Mike Reed, up in Marietta, for those of you in the metro area. He's fantastic. I highly encourage you to study with him. But yeah, let's talk about developing our UX Kung Fu, or Gong Fu. So the term Gong Fu, originally it described any kind of laboring that human beings engaged in, but it came to take on this cluster of related meanings, including the time and effort someone invests into an activity, the ability to accomplish what we set out to do, and even the results of what it was that we set out to do, right? Like it comes to even refer to the things that result from setting an intention and then accomplishing it. So you can have all kinds of Gong Fu, like tea making. Because of these associations, Gong Fu now applies to any of the arts of living and effective skills that we cultivate: cooking, public speaking, and of course the things that we do as UXers. So like think about our colleagues who are excellent at diagramming or who are fantastic facilitators, right? The result of a Gong Fu practice is to cultivate, through step-by-step guidance, the practitioner. They reach higher and higher levels of artistic perfection. And there are a number of practices that a Confucian will take on And I encourage you to explore some of these. Like a friend of mine, Bin Song, for example. Bin Song has a meditation for sleep, because sleep is important, not just for Confucians, but for everybody. And he has a nice little one. I can share a link with you in my blog about how you can go about that. But for our purposes today, I want to share a few vocabulary terms with you that have been useful for me in thinking about my UX work. The terms I'm going to share with you, again, I don't need you to become fluent in Chinese. You don't even necessarily have to remember the Chinese word as such, but just the translation, and marinate on what it might mean for you. They're not just descriptions of truth. They also are summoning our internal energies, and they enable us to adjust our relationships with others. And in this way, I hope that you find them useful for you as well. The first term that I'd like for us to think about is this term "xin," which can be translated as living up to one's word, right? The value that we as UXers present to organizations is our ability to provide good counsel to our stakeholders. But how is that good counsel produced? It's not simply the accretion of studies conducted that might be part of how we come to generate trust. Uncovering insights into customer and user behaviors is of course valuable, but those are only really tactical matters, and good counsel is a matter of strategy, right? So to be trustworthy, to be that person that could give good counsel and be relied upon for it, to be trustworthy is not something that's you're not just born that way, right? It's something that you have to enact. So how might this be useful for us? The term "xin," right, this making good on our word, it occurs more than 36 times in the Analects. It's such an important concept that Confucius tells his students in the Analects that I'm not sure anyone who does not make good on their word is viable as a person. If we look at the use of the word "xin" in the Analects, it comes up, it's really frequently paired with another term that we're going to look at in a second, "zhong," which means doing our utmost. So "xin" is this link, like making good on our word it's this link between saying and doing. It's a matter of consistency among our words and our actions. So in UX, "xin" is useful for us when we're thinking about scope creep, right? "Xin" is there to ground us when our stakeholders ask us to incorporate a new feature into our process, or when they ask us to include a different market segment, right? It is our responsibility in those moments to demonstrate our interpersonal and professional credibility by reminding our stakeholders that yes, those features can be incorporated. Sure, we can include those market segments that weren't initially discussed. And here are going to be the resource costs associated with that, right? We have to be true to those things. So the constant challenge for us as we grow in our careers and in our interpersonal relationships is to ensure that we don't overpromise and then underdeliver. So let's think about this other term that frequently gets paired with "xin," "zhong," doing our utmost, right? UX research and design requires a number of skills, and foremost among those is the ability to communicate effectively. Right? A UXer needs to be able to easily illustrate the connection between the big picture strategy stuff and also the minutia, right? The in the weeds tactical stuff. And there isn't really only one audience either, right? A UXer needs to be able to appreciate the differences between the needs of the folks that comprise their cross-functional team, as well as other parts of the organization and business that have no idea that maybe even the experienced team exists, right? So, for instance, when we're sharing findings from our process, right, we might, with a fellow researcher, it may be perfectly appropriate to get into the weeds with them about the decision to use a particular methodology rather than another one, right? But that same study will likely need to be communicated in a very different way for the C-suite decision-making types, right? And of course, often what the UXer is being asked to communicate is an argument for doing something different from what the team or the business had been doing up until very recently, right? So we have to be able to not only communicate well for the audience, but we also have to communicate the value and the risk associated with what has happened here. So a UXer needs to be able to communicate what they did, but also the winning case for why the team's or the organization's resources need to be redistributed in another way. And to make these winning cases, the audience has to be properly understood and addressed in terms that are compelling to them. This is part of how we do our utmost. So how do we learn to appreciate those differences within our organizations? And I think this is where Zhong can be really helpful for us, for doing our utmost as a way of a lens of thinking about where we are. Because in order for me to do my best, right, to do my utmost, a couple of things need to happen. I need to understand who I am. Now we can kind of roll back a little bit and think about that earlier passage from 2:14 about like at 15 I set out in a direction, right? And then I learned to take my place. And I get better at knowing how to know which direction in which to go, right? These are matters of like becoming better and better at understanding who we are. It's not something that just happens once and then you're just good for the rest of your life, right? We find ourselves repeatedly throughout our lives asking ourselves, who am I? What am I about, right? That's okay. In fact, it may even be ideal. The second thing that needs to happen is we need to appreciate the context in which we find ourselves, right? And so we can think back again to that passage in 2:14, right? Like that we come to realize the terrain around us, that we can follow along in tune with what that terrain affords us. Again, these are ideal things that we hopefully can practice often throughout our lifetimes. So Zhong means not only doing our best, but also to give ourselves over fully to the task at hand. But to give ourselves fully is not the same thing as like self-abnegating workaholism, right? For a while, maybe like 20 years ago, folks were really interested in flow. This is, I think, what's being referred to here. And in fact, Csikszentmihalyi's son is a sinologist, a Chinese philosophy specialist, for what's worth, those of you who are really nerdy and into that flow concept. So to do our utmost and give ourselves fully is only possible when we are authentically ourselves. And we can only be authentically ourselves when we wholeheartedly participate in the rituals that mediate our interpersonal relationships. In those interpersonal relationships, we find ourselves with opportunities to perform what is excellent about ourselves, but we also find ways of being replenished by what is excellent in others. So think about this conference, for example, right? Like to be an excellent audience member does not mean to only be a passive recipient of what happens, right? I have been in the situation where I've been on the, like right now, right? Like I've been in the situation when we're live and just the dread that overcomes when we have to speak in front of an audience. And it's so wonderful to have an audience member who's there and really there with you, right? That's a way for both of us to be excellent, right? There's the deference that the audience member gives, like they defer to the person on stage. And then there's the outward excellence that the person on stage gives. And there's this reciprocity that's at the heart there, right? So to do our utmost, sure, it's a matter of personal resolve, right? Like I'm going to do it, but it's not enough to make an oath. We also have to make good on our words, right? Xin. And to be as consistent as possible between our words and our actions requires that we have an effective plan. And that we demonstrate the discipline to follow through on that plan. In other words, we need a solid methodology and a process for doing our utmost and making good on our word. And that's where shu comes into play. Just a moment ago, I used the word deference to talk about the relationship between a presenter and an audience member. And one of the ways that we can translate this word shu is deference, in fact. It can also mean empathy. It can mean a few different things depending on the context. Kind of like in English, like when we talk about, you're going to take a right, and then write it down. Each of those words sounds like basically the same thing, and you have to listen to the context to understand what's actually happening there. Similarly, we have something like that going on in the Chinese terms. But again, you don't have to be excellent in Chinese. I just want you to think about what does it mean to make good on your word, to do your utmost. And here, let's think a little bit about empathy and deference and reciprocity. So there's this fantastic Chinese philosophy scholar, D.C. Lau, that tells us that when we are able to do our utmost, we are then able to put into effect what we have found through this process of shu that we're going to discuss. Confucius himself tells his students at one point that all of his teachings are bound together with one continuous thread. And this is relevant for us as we think about our career and career changes that we may make or have made in the past. What is this one continuous thread that runs throughout all of that? He tells, we learn in Analects 4:15 that the way of Confucius is doing one's utmost and putting oneself in the place of others, nothing more. Putting oneself in the place of others might resonate with some of us, right? It's going to sound maybe a little bit like the golden rule, which we'll get to. So doing UX work, in doing my UX work, I found that the most utility from thinking with and acting on what I understand by this term, shoot. And thinking with this term is what I'd like to spend the remainder of my time with you doing, right? But first, we need to kind of unpack a little bit this word empathy. The first thing that really struck me about UX when I started getting into it was I had never run across so many people who use this word empathy without a care in the world. I had never heard it so frequently. And I was like, what do you mean by empathy, right? That's a heavy concept. So anyone familiar is going to hear it thrown around quite a bit. Anyone familiar with UX is going to hear that quite a lot. The UXer is often referred to as the person in the organization who is the voice of the user or the customer. And in order to communicate those voices, the UXer has to rely on their empathic or empathetic abilities to really hear what those people are saying, right? A very noble cause. But what is empathy? Believe it or not, it began as an obscure technical term, einfühling, which literally means feeling into. And it was used by German art historians in the late 19th century. And Robert Fischer used the term to describe the process in which people project their emotions and ideas onto objects, right? So note this motion, from me onto you, or a thing, or a process. So this process of feeling into explained why folks so often say that they were moved by a piece of music, or they say they became lost in a painting. The paradox of empathy is that it is fundamentally a selfish feeling if the practitioner is not carefully trained. Consider again what it means to say that we get lost in a powerful work of art. When we have such a powerful response to a work of art, it is life-affirming, right? Because it allows us to project our enjoyment of that thing onto the rest of the world. When an artwork fails to accomplish that, when it fails to elicit this response, people will say things like, I'm not feeling it, or this painting is impenetrable. And this paradox is in the definition of empathy, and it's also present in the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would want done unto you, from Matthew 7:12 or Luke 6:31. Now, if I were a literalist, just to make this like really brass tacks, like, okay, golden rule is Chinese stuff, what's going on here? Here's a concrete example. If you could see me in person, you could tell I love ice cream. You can see it in my physique, right? I love ice cream and I love my wife. If I give my wife ice cream because I would want her to give me ice cream, I would inadvertently be causing harm to my wife because she's lactose intolerant. So I'd really be really missing the mark, right? This is one of the challenges. Okay, well, what does that matter, Paul? Come on, like ice cream, Chinese stuff. Well, a quick scan, if you just search for Golden Rule UX, right, yields a number of recommendations. Surprisingly, there's a ton of this stuff out there. And as UXers, we are really trained to seek clarification for when people tell us that they're not feeling it, or like they're not into whatever the process is that's set up in front of them. We're trained to hunt that down and really try to understand the how it doesn't hit them, right? We want to know how our software, how our product or service fails to move our respondents. So because, as UXers, we want to create moments and processes and objects that foster relationships between us and that make our laboring more rewarding and less toilsome. I want to avoid the ice cream lactose poisoning scenario, both professionally and interpersonally. But of course, I am not the user. So maybe a golden rule isn't precisely what I'm after. And here, I think Confucianism may be of some help for us. Instead of a golden rule, let's consider Confucius's golden method. One of Confucius's students was a cat named Zigong. Zigong, prior to rolling with Confucius, Zigong had been sort of a wealthy or a well-off merchant of a kind. But Zigong has a hard time understanding this shu concept, this like deference, empathy, reciprocity thing. It's kind of it's a tough one for him. It's a tough nut to crack. And so throughout the Analects, you hear them talking about it a few times. So Zigong asks his teacher, Confucius, if there is a practice that that we can practice throughout our lives. To this, Confucius presents the term shu. And he says, do not impose onto others what you yourself, what you do not desire yourself, right? It's still not really working with him. So then Zigong asks at another point, after discussing this golden method stuff, and Confucius comes back with another response. He says that being able to see an analogy in what is near at hand is the method of becoming human-hearted. The term, this is like a core value for Confucians, this becoming human-hearted, Ren. It's kind of a play on words because Ren is also literally the word for a person. So not only does it mean human-hearted, it also means anybody with a belly button. It's kind of like that old Yiddish thing about like, that guy's a real mensch, right? Very similar. So Confucius tells his students at another point in the Analects that doing one's utmost while practicing this shu golden method is the single thread that unites all of his teachings. To understand shu as a methodology that I can apply in my professional life, I found it useful to follow Roger Ames and David Hall when they tell us that shu is not simply taking oneself as the model and then projecting oneself onto others, but rather it is first clarifying ourselves in those relationships among us. Like, who am I in relation to you? Like, how is it that we work with each other? Who is it that we know in common? Like, how can we best facilitate what it is we're each after? And then knowing when it is time for us to shine and when it is time for them to shine, right? Having this kind of deferential action between us. So as a method, let's also think about what a method is, right? A method is a technique that can be mastered by us in the sense that an artist masters their craft. I like to think of professional athletes and musicians in this way because both musicians and athletes literally embody what their method has shown them. Like in their mastery of their craft, the practitioner is enabled to improvise, right? They know when to try a different technique or a different tactic as the situation requires. So how might shu, this golden methodology, how might it be useful for us? Well, I found it to be useful, or really even critical to doing some really tactical things that you would just expect of a UXer, like interviewing respondents, right? Or facilitating workshops. When interviewing folks, practicing deferential shu enables me to both listen well to what that person is communicating both verbally and non-verbally, right? But also be able to adjust my questions to address their particular situation, right? I may have a schedule of questions to ask, but if I'm not listening, I'm going to miss out on some key opportunities and insights. Shu helps me understand that. The shu methodology also requires that I not only defer to and draw forth the excellent of others, but also that I see an analogy in what is near at hand. This kind of analogy finding or metaphor making is what we call synthesizing the data, right? Like it's taking a very specific thing and then finding in that very specific example how it is applicable to the global whole or a very large portion of the global whole, right? It's also what's at the heart of persona creation, right? A persona is not somebody you actually designed for, but instead it is a collection of insights that we've gathered and a way of us being able to holistically, or how taking this particular example and understanding holistically a much larger group. So shu is really useful in these ways. Okay, so I hope from that quick introduction, I hope that you come away with this understanding again that your career is more than just the accumulation of projects that you've completed. It is a critical part of your flourishing life. And Confucian philosophy has some helpful resources for developing your flourishing lives. And golden rules are paradoxical, and we should take great care when we're thinking about them. Okay, so here we're going to have a quick little song and dance here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Abriel can share hers. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how Abriel has found some of these ideas useful in her own career. So take it away.
Thanks, Paul. And so, like Paul just mentioned, when we were putting this together, I I really felt like a lot of these Confucian philosophies were already a part of my work, but I never even realized it until literally, 2 months putting this together. And so I thought I wanted to share some of my stories as I've been growing in the 2 years that I've been doing UX. And so I wanted to start off with my very first research project. Now, I've done other research projects with other designers, whether it was helping them do hypothesis or developing like recruitment. I was kind of side by side with someone because I was just learning how to develop it. But this is the very first time that I ever finished up hypothesis, goals, and everything all by myself. And so when I was doing this, I got peer reviews, obviously, but I felt like, yes, I totally have this. I had my project done, but then came the harder part that I didn't realize. So when I was getting my resources and my recruitment for participants together, I went to my stakeholder and said, hey, I need a little bit of help. And so I got one person that I emailed and I communicated with on this project, but I didn't get very good response from like meeting them once. And so I would keep bouncing back and forth to different people, but I kind of kept getting blocked. And so while completing this, it was 2 weeks later, I had no idea what I was going through. I had no idea what I was going to do. I was completely lost. And then I remembered I need to reach out and find more people to really help me in my project. And so I remembered from a couple of years back when I first moved down here to Atlanta, I remembered from Ladies That UX Hustle Summit event, Lisa. I had met her then, and then she actually just happened to start working within our organization. And she kind of works somewhere over here within this really, really big org. Usually it gets completely lost. You never know where you're going to find these different resources. But I was able to remember her and reached out to her and said, hey, I kind of need a little help with this. And so we were able to collaborate, and she had me sort of reach out to more people and get everything completed for this project. And some lessons that I really learned here, like I just mentioned, Lisa really helped me to cast my line. So if you're not reaching out to different people, whether it's in Slack messages or your organization's big kind of Slack, Teams, what have you, just reaching out to different resources, because people are always free to help you. They want to have you do your very best. And collaborating more and often. And so when you're collaborating with different people, you're forming these different ideals and, forming your own philosophies on how you would actually complete different research. And so how I'm applying this different UX Kung Fu in this story. So I'm living up to my word in this story. How would I be remembered for this particular research project? And so I mentioned the 2-week scope that I had, right? It kept creeping up and it kept getting to me where eventually I had to be brave and I had to cast my line out and collaborate with more people. Otherwise, I would be remembered as the person that was really slow on getting the research done and, not living up to my word as a professional. But personally, I'd like to make sure that things get done in a timely manner. But also, I was striking out at this point to Paul's quote earlier. I was striking out in this new direction. And so I'm just starting here, like I mentioned earlier. This was my very first research project that I did by myself. And so I was figuring out, where am I actually going to go? I have no idea what to do. And so here, and when we're mentioning these different levels in my stories, I want you to remember too, like just because level 1 here, level 3, like nothing's ever going to be Yes, I'm a level 2 now because of these different achievements, right? I want you to basically remember we're always going to be doing something that kind of interweaves, striking out in a new direction for a different ideal, or, becoming a leader because you're really good at this one particular skill. And Paul, did you have anything to add in this particular section too?
Only just that, again, they're mileposts in one sense. Like, it's useful to have some reference for, like, I'm progressing along in a certain way. But it's also, I think, really key for us to recognize that we practice a lot of these really important skills throughout our careers. What changes is that it's not that we pass by those mileposts, but we become really consummate performers of the things we expect of people at particular points in their career. To become really consummate at it means that we practice it quite a lot, and that we've learned to distribute, I think, more and more frequently the load of that. And, like, how is it that we can work with others in a way such that many hands makes for a lighter load? But I'll get out of this.
No, you're fine. And so I just wanted to make sure that, you had your ideals and your thoughts in here too, as we're doing this. And so then I'm getting to the story. Of course, unfortunately for everyone in the world, COVID hit, and it affected a lot of people, including different projects that you were probably working on. And of course, I had to pivot and change as this happened too. And so this gets into a little bit of my story about presenting my research, where I was talking about pivoting and having to talk with other people and see at this point, oh, I'm actually doing more remote research now because I'm not able to do it with actual participants in a room, right? But then I finally actually, at this point, I was able to complete this research and I presented it out to my team. But in this story, Lisa is actually back in this story, where she reached out to me and she said, oh, I have this really great research project that I'm working on that really coordinates the research that you just completed in the earlier story. Can I have your research? Can I talk to you about it? And literally I felt like a superstar. And I kind of always think this in my head every time something goes great. I have this little GIF in my head. So you kind of know what's a little bit going on in my head. But again, I just felt like a complete superstar because it was my first research project I did by myself and got completed. But then when I talked to Lisa about the different research and recommendations that I made to my stakeholders and my team, she actually happened to know the team that featured the product I wanted to implement different changes into. She said, hey, you should go talk to the A team. And I said, that's amazing. I'm glad you know them. I'm going to reach out right away, and I want to present my research to them. And so a week later, that's what I ended up doing. I ended up presenting this research to them and talking to them about potential alignment in order to get some of these implementations and features in there. And so ways that I think about alignment, it's basically letting the data speak for itself. Because you did all of this hard work to get these numbers and get these customer stories out there, but also these numbers represent ways that your particular needs are also can complement their features needs to ultimately help each other's experiences and could expand across the company too. But then I think of this as the glass half full. So I kind of say, don't ever think about the glass as half empty personally or professionally, because you are awesome, and I just want you to know that. Really think about, like, yes, I have the data is going to speak for itself, everyone's going to super agree with this. I want you to be a little bit like the sailboat in the glass. I want you to be in the middle, where there's different prioritizations in their product team's features that could potentially complicate things and not have it implemented in time, but also be empathetic and understanding. They kind of know their customers a little better than you do. And so how I'm applying UX Kung Fu here is being able to do my utmost, where I'm mastering the storytelling, with having the data there, but also being able to speak fluently and articulating it the best possible way. But then also having empathy. As I mentioned, it's not just about the customer's pains that you're presenting within the story that you're telling. You also have to have the other side too, where product teams might not necessarily have the capacity to do it. It might not even be the right place. There could be other behind the scenes stuff that's going on to help prevent, some of it. And so being, compliant and complacent with, maybe there's some things that we can compromise on. And so here, this is where I'm kind of taking my place, because I just got done sort of exploring myself in this first story, but then now I'm sort of shipping this research product out and trying to introduce this into the other team, where I am able to, configure with this team to decide, hey, maybe some timelines, but maybe not necessarily that. Paul, is there anything you wanted to add here before I go on to my last story?
Well, I think it's a really great point that you're making here, that we often, it would be great, at a certain point in our careers, it would be, and in certain moments even, right, in our lives, it would be great if things were just self-evident, they just spoke for themselves, especially when we're in industries where we are so craft oriented, right? We become excellent at visualizing processes and so on. It would be awesome if it could just speak for itself. But you're right, part of doing our best is not only that we become excellent in our craft, but also that we have a syncing between the thing that we set out to do and what our team needs, that we have the empathy, that we have within ourselves as close as possible actions and words. But we do have to know, part of doing our best is being able to articulate what it is we found, being able to provide a rationale. It's not just that we show how smart we are, but also that we really reach our audience so that they can really understand and feel comforted by the work that we've done. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think especially in this last story, the point that you just made about resonating with your audience, I think it's very poignant, because now I'm talking about a process flow that my PM and I had been working on for probably, I want to say a couple of months. We were working on this process. We were working with stakeholders to make sure everything was compliant when it came to the steps in what the user needed to in order to complete this different process flow. And I even went to the point of making mock-ups to represent the different states in which this process would go for the customer. But we started to realize there's a lot of complexity here, and we hadn't reached out to the other teams that could potentially be consuming our process flow. And we decided, let's go ahead and workshop this. Let's go ahead and get these different teams together to help really understand and hone in, are we actually doing the right thing? Are we asking the right questions here? And so I gathered those different team members to sort of help virtually do a workshop to give feedback on the flow that my PM and I had made for this different process. And so workshops are just a big way also of helping untangle this different complexity. And so how it helps is really helping finding each other. And so I was reaching out to these different teams to basically, seek out the guidance that I wouldn't have had in finding each other to bring this partnership, right? So basically we're shaking hands and figuring out, is this actually going to be the also best people as well. But knowledge sharing where these different teams, like in the earlier story with when I was first introduced to Lisa, she's in this big part of the organization, somewhere probably in the top, you don't really know. And so having this knowledge sharing to go across the different organization is a really vital way to make it one big cohesive family. And also to help accomplish this different collaboration within a workshop. So bringing the right people in. And when I say right people, making sure to designate, I could bring in probably 300 people for a workshop because there are probably a lot of different stakeholders that would have a stake in it, but keeping it limited to the people that have that particular function at the moment. So I could bring in an engineer who would tell the technical aspects of, a particular feature. But if it's not correlated to your objective or goal within that workshop, maybe it's not the right place for them. But then also providing the right activities too. There's a lot of different workshops and stuff you've probably seen in Miro or seen in other books where there's different activities that you can set up for different objectives. The one thing that I like to try and include, though, is icebreakers, because icebreakers are a really way of getting to know other people, of providing that potential knowledge share of people, and also, to the last point, just making a really great atmosphere. Because if you don't have a really great atmosphere within a workshop, the creativity and vibe within it, it won't conduce to a really great objective, potentially not meet your goals for that particular workshop. And though nothing happened here for our current objective yet, I still got a partner because now I have that person that I can reach out to on that particular product team to get different ideas. And then when we come back to it, I'm able to have that partner where I can go, okay, let's restart on this again. Let's get on this. And so how I'm applying UX Kung Fu here, I'm doing my utmost to help communicate and understand everyone's differences because everyone's coming from different product teams. And so being able to conduce and showcase these different ideas of feedback to each other is something that's really been useful. But then living up to my word of, I'm taking these different ideas and different feedback. I'm facilitating this workshop to conduce those ideas for people. And then empathy. So I'm not really, even though I'm the facilitator of a workshop, I'm not really the star. Everyone in the workshop is basically a star because they're contributing and they're being their whole selves in the workshop to give the feedback and communicate to people. But then also everyone benefits from you as the facilitator being awesome. And so this is where in the level 3, you're kind of guiding people and you're knowing where you're going now. You're able to take your stake in this particular product and say, I know that, even though it might not lead us somewhere in the right way, I'm able to lead in some guidance for everyone else to take us home to wherever. I mean, you could have a hypothesis to where you think it's going to go, but you're leading the charge and knowing you never know for a particular product or feature where it's actually going to go. And do you have any last comments here regarding level 3 at all?
Well, I think as we've been meeting throughout the summer and talking about what we would say today, and it just occurred to me now that what you were in this last story, you had said, well, nothing really happened, but I got a partner. And actually, I think what did happen, it was a subtle thing, is that we see here the double meaning of the word appreciation. Right? Like we appreciate the differences between people. Usually what we're talking about there is a kind of, I guess, shoe or deferential activity where we notice the nuances between folks. But there is this second understanding of appreciation also, like in the sense of like a family heirloom. increases in value over time as we come to understand the value of this thing in relationship to the context that we are in now. And so while that might not seem like a whole lot, actually, I think that that is the key subtle activity or subtle action, or maybe even like outcome, not output, but outcome, that comes from doing all the things you're describing. So, and you can talk about your career then appreciating in value, right? Like, so you move up into more senior roles and so on, into lead roles or people management roles and so on. So I think it's kind of great.
Yeah, I never really thought of that before, Paul. We've been working on that together, and then I never realized there was that double meaning to it as well. And so I just wanted to point out in the summary, I mentioned, like, we talked about levels here, right? But as Paul mentioned, there's this different growth that you could get to, whether it's, right now I'm a junior, mid-level UXer, but then I'm growing in my career, right? Because you could intermix workshops with working on particular projects. So it's going to always interweave over time. You're not necessarily just going to be doing projects and then, oh, now I'm just going to do workshops. You're going to interweave that depending on the project that you're working on. And as I pointed out in the story here, there's different ways that you can apply UX Kung Fu. So different ways to apply empathy, different ways to be your utmost self, and then different ways to apply all the different Confucian philosophies. But then when you're really thinking about it, practice now and often. I really never thought I was practicing any of these until literally when Paul and I were putting this talk together. But really just being mindful that now you have these in your tool set to really just think about it and practice it often as you're growing as a UX designer. But then being authentically you. I just want you to be the best you that you can be personally and professionally, because as Paul mentioned earlier, you're now a part of this big UX family. And if you don't bring that authentic self to everyone else, you're not really connecting in the best way that you can to help you in your career, in your projects, product teams, whatever it may be. So I just want you to be authentically you. And so thank you everyone so much for letting us present. This has been really great, and I'm very excited to see how you apply your UX Kung Fu.
Thanks, Helen.
Yay! Thanks, guys. That was so amazing. I loved this. This was so interesting. I love the back and forth about the Confucian side of things and understanding the background and history of all of this, and then actually applying it to Abriel's experiences and what that looks like. That was amazing. Thank you so much. All right. And then, so I'm going to hop backstage again, but I'm next. So stay tight. I'm presenting, and then we'll have our break.